Some moments shatter a life so completely that the pieces can never be reassembled in quite the same way. England, 1809. The morning air inside St. Mary's Church carried the scent of lilies and beeswax, mingling with the nervous breath of 200 assembled guests. Sunlight streamed through the tall Gothic windows, casting coloured patterns across the stone floor where Amelia Fairmont stood alone in the sacristy, 24 years old, and dressed in ivory silk that had taken her mother's seamstress 6 weeks to complete. The gown's delicate lace sleeves brushed against her wrists as she smoothed imaginary wrinkles from the skirt, her green-grey eyes fixed on the heavy oak door that separated her from the nave beyond. Through the thick wood, she could hear the murmur of conversation growing louder. Lady Margaret Fairmont, her mother, stood beside her with lips pressed into a thin line of controlled anxiety. "He will be here momentarily," she said, adjusting the pearl necklace at Amelia's throat with fingers that trembled despite her assured tone. "Mr. Wentworth is merely fashionably delayed. You know how gentlemen can be on such occasions." But 30 minutes had passed since the ceremony should have begun. Amelia's bouquet of white roses felt heavy in her hands, the stems wrapped in ribbon that matched the cream of her dress. She had chosen the flowers herself from the gardens at their London townhouse, cutting each bloom at dawn when the petals still held morning dew. Oliver had admired her love of gardening during their courtship, calling it charmingly domestic. She wondered now if he would notice the roses at all. "Perhaps I should check with the rector," Lady Margaret murmured, though she made no move toward the door. Instead, she fussed with Amelia's veil, repositioning the delicate fabric that cascaded down her daughter's back. "Your father is speaking with the guests, assuring them that everything is proceeding as planned." Amelia nodded, though unease had begun to coil in her stomach. Oliver Wentworth, with his handsome face and ready smile, had courted her with flattering attention for 8 months. He was the second son of an earl, well-dressed and charming, full of talk about future investments and plans for their life together. Her parents had been delighted by the match. The Viscount Fairmont's modest fortune would be secured through such an advantageous connection, and Amelia would gain the social position befitting a young woman of good breeding. She had believed herself fortunate. Oliver laughed easily and danced well. He complimented her intelligence when she discussed the botanical texts her grandmother had left her. He seemed everything a husband should be. On the previous evening, she had found her father alone in the study, a glass of brandy cooling at his elbow, and several folded letters spread across the desk. He had covered them the instant she stepped inside, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Nothing for you to trouble yourself over," he had said briskly. "Once tomorrow is done, many things will be set to rights." At the time, she had taken it as a reference to social expectations, not a glimpse of some lurking catastrophe. Through the sacristy door, the murmurs had shifted in tone. Where before there had been polite chatter and occasional laughter, now there were hushed whispers, the sharp intake of breath that signalled scandal unfolding. Lady Margaret's face paled. "Wait here," she commanded, and swept from the room with her skirts rustling against the stone floor. Amelia remained motionless, the bouquet growing slick in her damp palms. She counted her heartbeats, each one louder than the last. Outside the narrow window, a sparrow landed on the sill and tilted its head, regarding her with one bright eye before flying away. How simple it must be, she thought, to have wings. The door opened. Her mother entered with the rector, a portly man whose normally jovial expression had collapsed into sympathy. Behind them came Amelia's father, Viscount Harold Fairmont, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out against his neck. In his hand, he clutched a folded piece of paper. "Amelia," her mother began, but seemed unable to continue. The rector cleared his throat. "Miss Fairmont, I am deeply grieved to inform you that Mr. Wentworth has sent word. He will not be attending the ceremony this morning." The words arrived like physical blows, each one striking against her ribs. Amelia stared at the paper in her father's hand, watching as he slowly extended it toward her. "He left this," her father said, his voice rough with suppressed fury. "A servant delivered it to the vestry entrance not 10 minutes ago." Her fingers moved without conscious thought. taking the letter and unfolding it. Oliver's handwriting sprawled across the page in confident loops, the same hand that had penned her love letters during their courtship. "Miss Fairmont," the letter began, dispensing with any pretense of warmth. "I find myself in a position where I must be forthright regarding circumstances that have recently come to my attention. I have determined that our union would not serve my interests as I had initially believed. I have made alternate arrangements that better suit my requirements. I trust you will understand that some matches are simply not destined to be fulfilled. I wish you well in your future endeavours. Your servant, Oliver Wentworth." The paper crumpled slightly in her grip. Not a word of apology, not even the courtesy of delivering this rejection in person. He had sent a servant, as though she were a tradesman being dismissed from employment. "What does it say?" her mother demanded, though Amelia suspected she already knew. News of this magnitude could not be contained. Already, the whispers beyond the door had risen to urgent conversations. Someone would have to inform the guests. Someone would have to send them away. The wedding breakfast at the Fairmont townhouse would go uneaten, the cake left uncut. "He has found someone else," Amelia heard herself say, her voice strangely distant. "Someone whose arrangements better suit his requirements." Her father made a sound between a growl and a curse. "The scoundrel," he muttered. "When I discover where he has gone, I shall demand satisfaction. This insult cannot stand." But even as he spoke, Amelia knew no satisfaction would come. Duels were illegal, and her father's influence extended only so far. Oliver Wentworth was the son of an earl. The scandal would cling to her, not to him. Society would whisper that she had somehow failed to secure him, that there must have been some deficiency in her person or character that drove him away. The other young women who had envied her impending marriage would now pity her, which was infinitely worse. "We must make an announcement," the rector said gently. "The guests cannot remain in uncertainty." Lady Margaret turned to him with desperate eyes. "Perhaps if we wait another hour, he might yet reconsider. Young men are prone to nervousness on such occasions." "Mother," Amelia interrupted, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "He is not coming. We both know this." Through the closed door, she could hear footsteps approaching. Male voices, one familiar. The door opened again, and Amelia looked up to see a tall figure standing in the entrance, silhouetted against the light from the nave beyond. Julian Merrick, the Duke of Hawthorne, stepped into the sacristy with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. He was 31 years old, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, his blue eyes sharp beneath straight brows. Amelia had met him only twice before, both times at social gatherings where they had exchanged no more than polite greetings. He was connected to her family through a distant relation. His late mother had been cousin to Amelia's grandmother, but they moved in different circles. Dukes did not typically concern themselves with the daughters of modest viscounts. "Your Grace," the rector stammered, clearly surprised by the appearance of such elevated company. "We did not expect—" "I was invited to witness the ceremony," Julian said, his gaze moving from the rector to Amelia. Something in his expression shifted as he took in her wedding dress, the crumpled letter still clutched in her hand, the devastation her mother was trying so desperately to conceal. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I take it the ceremony will not proceed as planned. Mr. Wentworth has withdrawn," Viscount Fairmont said through gritted teeth. Most irregularly, Julian's eyes flickered to the door through which he had entered, toward the nave where guests were beginning to realize the full scope of what had occurred. "The congregation is becoming restless," he observed. "Rumors are spreading. It would be advisable to make a formal announcement and dismiss the assembly before speculation becomes more damaging than it already is." He was right, of course. Every minute they delayed only worsened the scandal. Amelia forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "Thank you for your counsel, Your Grace," she said, and was grateful that her voice did not break. "I believe you are correct." For a moment, something passed between them. A flash of understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Julian's reputation as the Duke of Ice was well earned. He attended social functions with rigid courtesy, but never danced more than duty required, never courted anyone. never showed the slightest interest in the matrimonial pursuits that consumed London society. Yet now, standing in this small sacristy while her world collapsed around her, Amelia saw something shift in his expression. His hands, which had been clasped behind his back, tightened briefly. His gaze moved past her to the window where the sparrow had perched, then returned to her face. "I will speak to the guests if you wish," he offered. "Your family need not endure that particular ordeal." Lady Margaret looked as though she might weep with gratitude, but Viscount Fairmont shook his head. "That is generous, Your Grace, but this is my responsibility. I will address them." Julian inclined his head in acknowledgement, then turned his attention once more to Amelia. "Miss Fairmont," he said quietly, "I am sorry for this circumstance. You deserve far better treatment than you have received today." As he walked away toward the nave, a single stubborn thought lodged itself in his mind. No one should have to endure such humiliation alone. He had seen men broken on battlefields, treated with more kindness than society would offer Miss Fairmont in the days to come. The injustice of it sat ill with him, a stone beneath the skin that refused to stop pressing. Before she could formulate a response, he stepped back and exited the sacristy, leaving her standing amid the ruins of her wedding day. Through the still open door, she watched him walk down the aisle toward the assembled guests, his posture straight and purposeful. Something about the set of his shoulders suggested barely contained anger, though his face remained composed. That night, while London society gossiped over their dinner tables about poor Miss Fairmont and her vanished bridegroom, Amelia sat alone in her bedroom and made a decision. She would not remain in this city to be pitied and whispered about. She would not wait for her parents to arrange some lesser match to salvage her reputation. There was a place she could go, far from the judging eyes and false sympathies. Willowmere Cottage, her grandmother's small estate in Derbyshire, left to Amelia in a separate bequest, but treated by her parents as little more than a forgotten corner of the family holdings. Remote, quiet, a refuge where she could disappear until the scandal faded, if it ever did. She began to pack before midnight, moving silently through her room and selecting only what she could carry. By dawn, she was gone, slipping out of the townhouse before the servants had risen, hiring a coach with the small sum of money her grandmother had left her in a separate bequest. The coachman asked no questions when she requested passage north, away from London, away from everything she had known. As the city disappeared behind her and the countryside opened ahead, Amelia allowed herself one last thought of Oliver Wentworth and his cruel letter. Then she folded that memory away like the wedding dress she would never wear again, and turned her face toward whatever future waited in the wild gardens of Willowmere. The journey north took 2 days of rattling carriage wheels and changing horses at posting inns where Amelia kept her head down and spoke to no one beyond what courtesy required. She arrived at Willowmere Cottage in the late afternoon of the second day, when the spring sun hung low over the Derbyshire hills and cast long shadows across the overgrown drive. The cottage itself sat at the end of a narrow lane, bordered by hedgerows gone wild, its stone walls covered in climbing ivy that had not been trimmed in years. Mr. and Mrs. Davies, the elderly couple who maintained the property, emerged from the front door as the carriage rolled to a stop. They were both past 60, grey-haired and stooped, but with kind faces that showed surprise rather than judgment at her unexpected arrival. Mrs. Davies wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron and hurried forward. "Miss Fairmont," she said, her voice carrying the soft burr of the local accent. "We had no word you were coming. The cottage is not prepared for visitors of quality." "I am not a visitor, Mrs. Davies," Amelia replied, accepting the woman's help as she descended from the carriage. "I intend to stay for some time. Please do not trouble yourself with elaborate preparations. Whatever state the house is in will suffice." The cottage was smaller than she remembered from childhood visits with her grandmother. 2 stories of grey stone with narrow windows and a slate roof that showed signs of needed repair. Inside, the furniture stood shrouded under holland covers, and a smell of disuse hung in the air, despite Mrs. Davies's obvious efforts to keep the place from falling into complete neglect. The parlour fireplace held cold ashes, and moisture stains marked the ceiling in one corner, where rain had found its way through deteriorating slate. "We'll have fires lit straight away," Mr. Davies said, already moving toward the woodpile. And I'll see about that leak in the roof come morning. Didn't expect anyone to need the place this season. Amelia walked through the room slowly, removing her gloves and bonnet. The cottage held memories of her grandmother, who had lived here in widowhood and tended the gardens with passionate devotion. Those gardens now lay visible through the back windows, transformed into a wilderness of overgrown roses and tangled herb beds. The sight of them sent an unexpected pang through her chest. This was what abandonment looked like. This was what happened when no one cared enough to maintain what had once been beautiful. "I will restore the gardens," she announced, surprising herself with the declaration. "Starting tomorrow." Mrs. Davies exchanged a glance with her husband. "That's a considerable task, miss. The grounds have gone quite savage these past years since your grandmother passed." "Then I shall become equally savage in reclaiming them," Amelia said, and meant it. She needed occupation, needed something to exhaust her body so thoroughly that sleep would come without dreams of wedding ceremonies that never happened. "I brought very little with me. Tomorrow I shall need to visit the nearest village for supplies. Where might I find a market?" "Millbrook, miss," Mr. Davies replied. "Quarter-hour's ride on horseback, though longer by foot. They have a market day each Thursday. Small place, but folk are decent enough." That night, Amelia slept in her grandmother's old bedroom, under quilts that smelled of lavender sachets Mrs. Davies must have placed in the wardrobe. The bed was smaller than her London one, the ceiling lower, the window offering a view of nothing but dark countryside and distant stars. No street lamps here, no sounds of carriages passing, only silence, broken occasionally by the call of a night bird or the rustle of wind through the ivy. She did not cry. The tears had dried somewhere during the journey north, leaving behind a peculiar emptiness that felt almost like peace. Oliver Wentworth belonged to her past now, along with London society and her mother's anxious social manoeuvring. Here, in this forgotten corner of Derbyshire, she could be no one's disappointment. She could simply exist. 3 weeks passed in a blur of physical labour that left her hands blistered and her muscles aching. She rose at dawn and worked in the gardens until dusk, hacking away at brambles, pulling weeds that had rooted themselves with stubborn determination, coaxing order from chaos, one bed at a time. Mr. Davies helped when his other duties allowed, teaching her which plants were worth saving and which had grown too wild to recover. Mrs. Davies brought meals and worried aloud that Miss Fairmont was working herself into illness, but Amelia paid no heed. The work felt necessary, almost holy in its simplicity. Plant, water, weed, repeat. The letter from her parents arrived on a grey morning when rain threatened but had not yet fallen. Mrs. Davies brought it with breakfast, her expression suggesting she knew its contents would not please. Amelia broke the seal and read the cramped lines of her mother's handwriting. The letter was cold in tone, filled with reproaches about her sudden departure and demands that she return immediately to London. There were matters to discuss, her mother wrote, delicate situations requiring Amelia's presence. The scandal had not faded as quickly as hoped, and new arrangements needed to be made. She must accept the next suitable proposal that came her way, regardless of her personal feelings. Her duty to the family required it. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat that if she did not return within the fortnight, they would come to fetch her themselves. Amelia set the letter aside and did not reply. Instead, she went out to the gardens and attacked a particularly stubborn patch of nettles with renewed vigour. The following Thursday, she rode one of the Davies' old horses into Millbrook for market day. The village was indeed small, consisting of a main street lined with shops, a church with a square stone tower, and a green where farmers had set up stalls selling vegetables and cloth. People stared at her with open curiosity. A stranger was rare enough here, but their faces held no malice, only interest. She was examining a basket of seed packets at one of the stalls when a woman approached. Middle-aged, dressed in widow's black, with a face that radiated kindness, she smiled at Amelia with genuine warmth. "You must be Miss Fairmont from Willowmere," the woman said. "Mrs. Davies mentioned you had arrived. I am Mrs. Beatrice Hartley. My late husband was the vicar here for 30 years. I live just beyond the green in the old rectory." "Mrs. Hartley," Amelia replied. grateful for the woman's straightforward manner. "A pleasure to meet you. I knew your grandmother well," Mrs. Hartley continued. "She was a formidable gardener. The roses at Willowmere were famous throughout the county. I hear you are attempting to restore them." Attempting is perhaps too generous a word. Battling might be more accurate. Mrs. Hartley laughed, a rich sound that drew smiles from nearby vendors. "Your grandmother would approve. She believed gardens required both love and stubbornness in equal measure. If you find yourself in need of advice, or simply conversation, my door is always open. It can be lonely in the countryside for those accustomed to London." The kindness in her voice nearly undid Amelia's carefully maintained composure. She managed a smile and a murmur of thanks before making her purchases and retreating to her horse. But the encounter stayed with her during the ride back to Willowmere. Mrs. Hartley had not asked prying questions or made reference to scandals. She had simply offered friendship, which was more valuable than gold. The second letter from her parents arrived a week later, more urgent in tone. Her mother wrote of financial difficulties that required immediate attention. They needed Amelia to understand the gravity of their situation. Her father had made investments that had not yielded expected returns. She must return to discuss their options. Amelia read this letter twice, unease growing in her stomach. Her father had always been private about money matters, but she had never suspected true financial trouble. Still, returning to London felt impossible. She folded the letter away and did not answer. The afternoon sun was slanting toward evening when Amelia heard the sound of approaching horses. She was in the garden, dirt under her fingernails and sweat dampening her dress despite the mild temperature. The sound was unexpected. No one visited Willowmere. She straightened slowly, wiping her hands on the apron she had borrowed from Mrs. Davies, and turned toward the front of the cottage. Two riders emerged around the corner of the house. One was a servant in dark livery, but the other made her breath catch in surprise. Julian Merrick, Duke of Hawthorne, sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. He was dressed for travel, his dark coat dusty from the road, his blue eyes sweeping across the cottage grounds before settling on her. For a moment, neither spoke. Amelia was acutely aware of her dishevelled appearance, the mud on her skirt, the fact that she stood before a duke looking like a common labourer. Julian dismounted with fluid efficiency and approached slowly, as though dealing with a startled deer. "Miss Fairmont," he said, his voice carrying the same measured tone she remembered from the church. "Forgive the intrusion. I came to ensure you were well." "Your Grace," she managed, though her mind raced with questions. What was he doing here? How had he known where to find her? "This is unexpected." "I imagine so." He glanced toward the gardens, taking in the evidence of her work. "Your parents were concerned about your sudden departure. They asked if I might verify your safety." The lie was transparent. Her parents would never presume to make requests of a duke. Whatever had brought Julian Merrick to Derbyshire, it was his own decision. Amelia felt her defences rise automatically. "As you can see, I am perfectly well. You may report to whomever you wish that I am in no need of rescue." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his expression. "I had not intended to rescue you, Miss Fairmont, merely to satisfy myself that you had not met with misfortune. And now that you have satisfied yourself?" "Now," he said quietly, "I find myself wondering whether you would permit me to stay in the area for a short while. I have a property nearby that requires my attention. Thornwick Lodge, a hunting property that has been neglected. It would be convenient to oversee its restoration." Amelia stared at him. The Duke of Hawthorne did not personally oversee minor properties. He had stewards and agents for such tasks. This was clearly a pretext, but for what purpose? "Your Grace, I do not require supervision or companionship. I came here precisely to be alone." "I understand," Julian replied, "and I have no intention of imposing on your solitude. I simply wished you to know that I will be nearby, should you have need of anything." Before she could form a response, he inclined his head in farewell, mounted his horse with the same efficient grace, and rode away with his servant following. Amelia stood in the garden, watching until they disappeared down the lane, and wondered what game the Duke of Ice was playing. Julian Merrick did not leave Derbyshire as Amelia had half expected. True to his word, he took up residence at Thornwick Lodge and proceeded to make his presence known through a series of practical interventions that she found simultaneously irritating and impossible to refuse. 2 days after his arrival, a carpenter appeared at Willowmere with materials to repair the leaking roof. When Amelia protested that she had not requested such assistance, the man simply shrugged and said the Duke had sent him. The following morning, a wagon arrived bearing lumber for the broken fence in the paddock, along with workers who completed the repairs before noon. Amelia considered riding to Thornwick to confront him, but pride held her back. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing how his interference both rankled and relieved her. Instead, she threw herself into garden restoration with renewed determination, as though proving she needed no one's help for the work she chose to do herself. Their encounters during those first weeks were brief and formal. Julian rode past Willowmere on his way to or from the village, always offering a courteous nod if she happened to be visible. Occasionally, he stopped to inquire whether she lacked anything essential, his tone suggesting he was merely fulfilling a duty to distant relations. She answered with equal formality, and he never pressed beyond polite conversation. Yet something about the way his gaze lingered on the restored sections of garden suggested genuine interest rather than mere courtesy. On a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Julian's arrival, Amelia rode into Millbrook for market day and found Mrs. Hartley selecting vegetables at one of the stalls. The older woman's face brightened at the sight of her. "Miss Fairmont, how fortunate," Mrs. Hartley said warmly. "I was hoping to see you. I have fresh scones cooling at home, and far too many for one person to consume. Would you join me for tea?" The invitation was offered with such genuine kindness that Amelia found herself accepting. Mrs. Hartley's cottage sat just beyond the village green, a tidy stone structure with flowers blooming in window boxes and a small garden that showed expert care. Inside, the rooms were modest but comfortable, filled with books and the lingering scent of baking. Over tea and scones still warm from the oven, Mrs. Hartley proved to be excellent company. She spoke of village life with gentle humour, never prying into Amelia's circumstances, but offering observations about the seasonal rhythms of countryside existence that Amelia's London upbringing had never taught her. When their conversation turned to gardening, Mrs. Hartley's eyes lit with enthusiasm. "Your grandmother had a gift for roses," she said, pouring more tea into Amelia's cup. "She could make them thrive in conditions that would defeat most gardeners. I remember one summer when drought killed every rose in the county except hers. People came from miles away to see how she had managed it. I wish I had learned more from her while I had the chance," Amelia admitted. "I was very young when she passed, and my parents were not interested in gardening as anything more than decorative." "Knowledge can be recovered," Mrs. Hartley replied. "I have some of her notes, actually. She gave me cuttings and instructions years ago. You are welcome to them if they would be useful." Before Amelia could respond, the sound of horses drew Mrs. Hartley to the window. "Ah, the Duke," she murmured. "He has been quite active in the neighbourhood since taking residence at Thornwick. Such a change from his reputation. One hears he never leaves London except for obligatory visits to his estates." Amelia rose and glanced through the window, seeing Julian dismounting in the village square. He moved with the same efficient grace she remembered, his dark coat and tall boots marking him as gentry, even without the ducal title. As though sensing observation, he looked toward Mrs. Hartley's cottage and met Amelia's gaze through the window. Something shifted in his expression, a momentary softening that vanished so quickly, she wondered if she had imagined it. "He is a man of few words, Mrs. Hartley continued, returning to her seat, "but many actions. Do you know, he arranged for repairs to the church roof without anyone requesting his assistance. The parish council was astonished. Such generosity is rare among nobility, particularly from those who have no estate connections to the area." "Perhaps he simply has more money than ways to spend it," Amelia said, more sharply than she intended. Mrs. Hartley's expression grew thoughtful. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he understands something about the value of practical kindness over empty gestures. My late husband used to say that a man's character shows most clearly not in his words, but in what he does when no one is demanding it of him. The Duke remains here without any social advantage to himself. One must wonder why." Amelia had no answer to that, or rather, she had several answers that she was not willing to examine too closely. After taking her leave and collecting her marketing purchases, she rode back to Willowmere, troubled by thoughts she could not fully articulate. That evening, while working in the garden as twilight deepened around her, Amelia heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to find Julian riding toward the cottage, alone this time, without even a servant accompanying him. He dismounted and approached slowly, as though uncertain of his welcome. "Miss Fairmont," he said, "forgive the interruption. I noticed your mare favoring her left foreleg when you returned from the village this afternoon. My man Thomas has experience with horse injuries. I thought perhaps he might examine her." Amelia glanced toward the small stable where Mr. Davies kept the horses. She had noticed nothing wrong, but then her knowledge of equine health was limited. "That is considerate of you, Your Grace, though I am certain Mr. Davies would have observed any serious problem." "Perhaps," Julian agreed. "But Thomas served as cavalry farrier during the war. He has skills beyond the ordinary. It would cost you nothing to allow him to look." There was something in the way he said it, a careful neutrality that suggested this was important to him for reasons beyond simple neighborly concern. Amelia found herself nodding acceptance, and Julian gestured to someone waiting beyond the garden gate. A man in his mid-40s approached, lean and weather-beaten, with steady hands and observant eyes. "Thomas Yates, miss," the man said with a slight bow, "if you will show me to your stable." While Thomas examined the mare, Amelia and Julian stood in awkward silence amid the partially restored rose beds. The evening air carried the scent of early summer, rich soil and growing things. Julian's attention drifted across the gardens, taking in the evidence of her labor. "You have accomplished a great deal in a short time," he observed quietly. "These beds show signs of careful planning, not merely random clearing." "My grandmother taught me the basics before she died," Amelia replied. "I have been attempting to recall her methods. She would be proud of what you have achieved." The simple statement, delivered without flattery or artifice, touched something unexpected in Amelia's chest. She looked at him properly, for the first time since he had arrived, studying the strong lines of his face in the fading light. "Why are you here, Your Grace? And I do not mean at Willowmere this evening. Why did you truly come to Derbyshire?" Julian's jaw tightened slightly. For a long moment she thought he would deflect or offer another transparent excuse. Instead, he met her gaze directly. "I saw what happened to you at St. Mary's. I saw your dignity in circumstances where many would have collapsed. And I saw a man who did not deserve you abandon you as though you were worthless. The entire situation was unjust. When I learned you had fled London, I wanted to ensure you had not come to harm. And having assured yourself you remain." "Yes," he said simply. "I remain." "Why?" His expression shifted into something almost vulnerable. "Because London society functions on performance and pretense. Because every interaction there is calculated for advantage. Because in all my years navigating that world, I never met anyone who seemed as genuinely themselves as you did, even in moments of private devastation. Because I lost my brother to war while I was playing politics in drawing rooms, and I learned that real courage is not always loud or obvious. You showed more courage walking out of that church with your head high than most men show on battlefields." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Amelia felt something shift inside her, a crack in the protective walls she had built. "Your brother," she said softly. "Mrs. Hartley mentioned you served together." "Thomas served with my brother," Julian corrected. "Edward was 8 years younger than I. He joined the cavalry against my advice and died at Talavera last year. I promised our mother I would protect him, and I failed. Thomas brought his effects home to me. He had been Edward's sergeant, and afterward had nowhere to go. So he came into my service." "I am sorry for your loss," Amelia said, meaning it. "Grief is a peculiar burden. It changes how one sees the world." "Yes," Julian agreed. "It does. It makes one impatient with meaningless social rituals and more aware of what matters. Which is why, Miss Fairmont, I find myself in Derbyshire attempting, rather poorly, to offer friendship to someone who clearly values her solitude." Before she could respond, Thomas emerged from the stable. "The mare has a stone bruise, miss," he reported. "Nothing serious if treated properly. I have applied a poultice and wrapped the hoof, Keep her stabled for 3 days with the poultice changed daily, and she should recover fully. Mr. Davies will know how to manage it. Thank you, Mr. Yates, Amelia said, grateful for the interruption that gave her time to compose herself. I am in your debt. No debt, miss. Happy to help. Julian mounted his horse, gathering the reins. I will leave you to your evening, Miss Fairmont, but I hope you will consider that friendship need not threaten independence. Sometimes it simply means knowing that someone stands ready to help when help is needed. He rode away into the gathering darkness, and Amelia stood alone among her grandmother's roses, wondering whether she had the courage to trust again. Not romantic trust, that felt impossibly distant, but the simpler trust of companionship, the trust that someone might stay without demanding more than she was ready to give. That night, she wrote a brief response to her parents' letters, informing them she was well and would remain at Willowmere indefinitely. She did not mention Julian Merrick or his presence at Thornwick Lodge. Some things were too complicated to explain in writing, and she was not certain she understood them herself yet. Summer arrived in earnest, bringing with it longer days and the slow transformation of Willowmere's gardens from wilderness into something approaching order. Amelia's hands had grown calloused from work, her complexion darker despite the bonnet she wore against the sun. The change pleased her. She felt substantial in a way London life had never allowed, rooted in soil and purpose rather than floating through drawing rooms like a decorative ornament. Julian's visits became routine, though never predictable. He appeared 3 or 4 times each week, sometimes bringing books he thought she might enjoy, other times simply joining her in whatever task occupied the moment. They developed an unspoken pattern of companionship that required little conversation but felt increasingly comfortable. He helped her stake climbing roses without being asked, worked alongside her weeding herb beds, and proved surprisingly knowledgeable about practical matters her education had ignored. One afternoon in mid-June, they found themselves trapped in the greenhouse when a sudden storm rolled across the hills. Rain hammered against the glass roof while thunder rumbled overhead, and Amelia set aside her trowel with a resigned sigh. Julian stood near the workbench, examining seed packets she had collected from Mrs. Hartley. Your grandmother was meticulous, he observed, reading the faded labels in her handwriting. She noted not just what she planted, but soil conditions, weather patterns, bloom times. These are records a botanist would value. She treated gardening as a science, Amelia replied, watching rainwater stream down the glass panes. My mother thought it unseemly for a woman of her station to spend so much time with her hands in dirt. They argued about it constantly. Your mother values appearances over substance. The blunt assessment startled her into laughter. Your Grace, that is hardly a polite thing to say. Julian, he corrected. We have been working side by side for weeks now. I think we can dispense with excessive formality when we are alone. He set down the seed packets and turned to face her fully. And I am not being impolite. I am being honest. Your mother prioritizes social position and reputation above all else. She would have had you marry a scoundrel rather than face temporary embarrassment. Amelia leaned against the workbench, studying him. The stormlight cast shadows across his strong features, and she noticed details she had previously overlooked. The small scar near his left temple, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of things that angered him, the unexpected gentleness in his hands when he handled fragile seedlings. You speak as though you know my mother well, she said quietly. I know women like her. London society is full of them. They sacrifice genuine happiness for the illusion of success, then wonder why their lives feel hollow. He paused, then added more softly. I watched my own mother do the same thing. She pushed Edward toward military glory because it sounded impressive at dinner parties, never considering whether it suited his temperament. He died trying to live up to expectations that meant nothing beyond social approval. Is that why you never courted anyone? Because you despise what London society values? Julian moved closer, close enough that she could see the darker flecks in his blue eyes. I never courted anyone because I never met anyone worth courting. Until I stood in that church and watched you face public humiliation with more dignity than most generals show on battlefields. until I saw you choose exile over compromise, until I came here and found you rebuilding something beautiful from ruins, asking for no one's approval or assistance. The air between them felt charged with more than the electricity of the storm. Amelia's heart beat faster, and she realized with sudden clarity that somewhere during these weeks of shared work and quiet conversations, something fundamental had shifted. This was not the superficial attraction she had felt for Oliver Wentworth, based on charm and flattery. This was something deeper, built on respect and genuine understanding. "I am not brave," she said, needing him to understand. "I ran away because I was too frightened to stay and face the consequences of Oliver's betrayal. You chose self-preservation over social martyrdom. That is wisdom, not cowardice." His hand moved to her arm, a gentle touch that sent warmth through her despite the storm's chill. "Amelia, I am not skilled with pretty words. I cannot court you with poetry or grand gestures, but I can offer you honesty. You have become important to me in ways I did not anticipate. Your strength, your dedication to restoring these gardens, the way you refuse to let cruelty diminish who you are, all of it matters to me." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to trust that this was real and not another illusion that would shatter. But fear held her tongue. Fear of being foolish again, fear of revealing how much she had begun to depend on his presence. The storm eased gradually, rain gentling to drizzle. Julian stepped back, giving her space she had not asked for, but perhaps needed. "I should return to Thornwick," he said. "Thomas will worry if I'm caught out too long in weather." After he left, Amelia remained in the greenhouse, pressing her palm against the place on her arm where his hand had rested. She could still feel the warmth of it, the careful restraint in his touch. He had offered her honesty, which was more than Oliver had ever given. But honesty also meant acknowledging her own feelings, and those terrified her more than any scandal. That evening, Mrs. Hartley arrived unexpectedly with a basket of fresh bread and preserves. Amelia invited her in for tea, grateful for the distraction from her tumultuous thoughts. The older woman settled into the parlour with comfortable familiarity, accepting her cup with a smile. "You have been seeing much of the Duke," Mrs. Hartley observed, her tone carefully neutral. "The village is quite interested in his continued presence here." "We are friends," Amelia replied, perhaps too quickly. "Nothing more." Mrs. Hartley's expression turned knowing. "My dear, my late husband used to say, judge people by their consistent actions, not their pretty words. The Duke has remained in Derbyshire for nearly 2 months now, far longer than any property inspection requires. He has no social obligations here, no family connections beyond the most distant. Yet he stays, and he spends his time helping you restore gardens that benefit him not at all. Actions speak quite loudly when one chooses to hear them. I do not know if I can trust my own judgment anymore," Amelia admitted. "I believed Oliver when he said he cared for me. I was completely wrong. Mr. Wentworth said what you wanted to hear. The Duke says what is true, whether or not it pleases. There is a considerable difference." Mrs. Hartley set down her teacup and leaned forward. "I am not suggesting you rush into anything, but do not let one man's cruelty blind you to another man's genuine regard. That would be letting Oliver Wentworth win, even in absence." After Mrs. Hartley departed, Amelia sat alone in the gathering dusk and allowed herself to examine the feelings she had been avoiding. She thought of Julian's patience, his understanding of her need for independence, his willingness to work beside her without demanding anything in return. She thought of the way he spoke about his brother with such raw grief, the careful way he handled delicate plants, the quiet fury in his voice when he mentioned Oliver's betrayal. Perhaps, she thought, trust was not something that arrived fully formed. Perhaps it was built gradually, like her gardens, one careful action at a time. Julian had been planting seeds of trust for weeks now, tending them with consistent care. The question was whether she had the courage to let them grow. The next morning, she woke to find a letter tucked under her door. Julian's handwriting, precise and clear. "Amelia, I spoke more plainly yesterday than I perhaps should have. If I have made you uncomfortable, I apologize. Your friendship matters more to me than any romantic consideration. I will respect whatever boundaries you require. Yours, Julian." She held the letter for a long moment, reading between the carefully formal lines to the vulnerability beneath. He was giving her permission to reject him without losing his companionship, offering safety even as he acknowledged deeper feelings. It was, she realized, exactly the sort of thing a man who truly cared would do. Amelia dressed carefully, plaited her hair with more attention than usual, and rode to Thornwick Lodge. Julian answered the door himself, surprise and something like hope flashing across his face before his usual composure returned. "I received your letter," she said without preamble. "And I have a response, though I would prefer to deliver it in person rather than in writing." "Of course. Please, come in." Ooh. She followed him into a study lined with books, noting the masculine simplicity of the furnishings. The maps spread across a large desk, the comfortable disorder of a space actually used for work rather than display. He gestured to a chair, but she remained standing, needing to say this while courage lasted. "You told me yesterday that you cannot offer poetry or grand gestures," she began. "But what you can offer is infinitely more valuable. You have given me time to heal. You have respected my need for independence while showing me I need not face everything alone. You have asked nothing of me except what I was willing to give freely." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I am not ready for courtship in any formal sense. The scandal is too recent, my heart too bruised. But I am ready to stop pretending I do not value your presence. I am ready to acknowledge that when you are not here, I miss you. And I am ready to see where honest friendship might lead, if given time to develop naturally." Julian's expression transformed, warmth replacing his usual guarded restraint. "Time is something I can offer in abundance," he said quietly. "I am in no hurry, Amelia. What matters is that you know I am here, and I will remain here as long as you permit it." The weeks following Amelia's visit to Thornwick passed in a haze of sunlit afternoons and quiet contentment. She and Julian fell into an easy rhythm of shared meals and companionable work, their conversations ranging from botanical minutiae to philosophical debates about literature and politics. He brought her books from his library, and she taught him the proper way to deadhead roses without damaging new growth. It felt natural in a way her courtship with Oliver never had, built on mutual respect rather than performance. Then, on a humid afternoon in late July, everything changed. Amelia was arranging cut flowers in the parlour when Mrs. Davies appeared at the door, her expression troubled. "Miss Fairmont, there is a gentleman caller. He says he is an old acquaintance and requests a moment of your time." Amelia's hands stilled on the roses. She had few acquaintances who knew of Willowmere's location. "Did he give a name?" "Mr. Oliver Wentworth, miss." The vase nearly slipped from her grip. For a moment, she could not breathe, could not think beyond the rushing sound in her ears. Oliver, here. After months of silence, he had somehow found her refuge and invaded it with his presence. "Tell him I am not receiving visitors," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I already did, miss. He was most insistent, said it was a matter of urgent importance regarding your family." Her family. Amelia's stomach twisted with anxiety. Perhaps something had happened to her parents. Perhaps this was not about Oliver at all, but genuine crisis. She set down the vase carefully. "Very well. Show him to the parlour, but ask Mr. Davies to remain nearby." Oliver Wentworth entered the room, looking much as she remembered. Handsome in a conventional way, with his fair hair and easy smile. But she noticed things now that love's blindness had concealed before. The slight wear on his coat cuffs, suggesting financial strain, the calculating assessment in his eyes as he took in the cottage's modest furnishings, the false warmth in his expression. "Amelia," he said, moving forward as though to take her hands. She stepped back instinctively, and he halted, hurt flashing across his face. "You look well. Country life suits you." "Mr. Wentworth," she replied coolly, deliberately formal. "Mrs. Davies mentioned urgent family matters. Please state your business quickly." His smile faltered. "I see you are still angry about our unfortunate misunderstanding in London. I had hoped time would have softened your feelings." Misunderstanding? The word emerged sharper than she intended. "You abandoned me at the altar with a cruel letter, and no explanation beyond your own self-interest. That was not a misunderstanding. That was betrayal. I was under tremendous pressure, Oliver said, his tone shifting to something pleading. Financial difficulties I could not escape. Catherine Bromley's family promised relief from my circumstances. I made a terrible mistake in judgment. And now? Amelia kept her voice level despite the anger rising in her chest. Have you come to apologize? To explain? What purpose could your presence here possibly serve? Oliver moved closer, and she caught the scent of desperation beneath his cologne. The arrangement with the Bromleys fell apart. They discovered the extent of my debts and withdrew their support before the marriage could take place. I find myself in an even more difficult position than before. He paused, then added with manufactured sincerity. But through it all, I realized what I had lost. You, Amelia. Your genuine affection, your steadfast character. I was a fool to prioritize money over true companionship. She stared at him in disbelief. You expect me to believe you came here out of rekindled affection? After everything? I came because I made a grievous error and wish to correct it. Society will forgive my hasty departure if we announce renewed intentions. Your reputation will be restored, and we can begin again on firmer ground. Surely you must see the wisdom in accepting this opportunity for redemption. The audacity of it left her momentarily speechless. He stood before her, suggesting reconciliation, as though he were offering charity rather than begging for rescue from his own failures. Before she could formulate a response, the parlor door opened. Julian stood in the doorway, and Amelia had never been more grateful to see anyone in her life. He took in the scene with one swift glance. Oliver's supplicating posture, her rigid stance, the tension crackling between them. His expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. Miss Fairmont, Julian said, his voice carrying the weight of ducal authority. I heard you had an unexpected visitor. I thought it prudent to ensure you were not distressed. Oliver's face paled as he recognized the Duke. Your Grace, I did not realize you were in residence nearby. This is a private conversation. Nothing about your presence here is private, Wentworth, Julian interrupted, moving into the room with predatory grace. You abandoned Miss Fairmont in the most public and humiliating manner possible. Your return now, uninvited and unwanted, constitutes harassment. I am merely attempting to repair damage caused by unfortunate circumstances, Oliver protested, though his voice had lost its confident edge. Surely your Grace understands that mistakes can be forgiven, arrangements reconsidered. I understand that you treated a woman of integrity and worth as though she were disposable, Julian said, his tone cutting. I understand that you now find yourself in desperate straits and view Miss Fairmont as a convenient solution to problems of your own creation. What I do not understand is how you possess the arrogance to imagine she would ever consider accepting your suit after such betrayal. Amelia felt something shift inside her, a final severing of whatever small doubt had remained. She looked at Oliver properly for the first time since he entered, seeing him with clear eyes unclouded by affection or nostalgia. He was exactly what Julian said. Desperate, manipulative, thinking only of his own advantage. Mr. Wentworth, she said, her voice steady and certain. The Duke is correct. You did not come here because you value me or regret causing pain. You came because your schemes failed, and you need rescue from consequences you brought upon yourself. But I am not a solution to your problems. I am not a commodity you can discard and then reclaim when convenient. Amelia, please be reasonable. I am being perfectly reasonable, she continued, cutting him off. What happened between us taught me something valuable. It taught me the difference between pretty words and genuine regard, between someone who takes what serves them and someone who gives without demanding return. You were never capable of real affection, Oliver. You were only ever capable of calculation. Oliver's expression shifted from pleading to something uglier. You think your position is secure here, alone and scandalous. Society will never forget what happened. No respectable man will want you after being publicly rejected. I am offering you a chance to salvage something from ruin, and you throw it back in my face. She does not need salvaging, Julian said, his voice dangerous in its quiet intensity. And she certainly does not need the doubtful honor of connection to a man drowning in debts and devoid of character. I suggest you leave, Wentworth, immediately. And if I choose to stay? To speak with Amelia further about matters that do not concern your grace? Julian's hand moved to rest on the back of a chair, and Amelia noticed the whiteness of his knuckles. Then you will discover exactly how much I can make your already difficult circumstances infinitely worse. I have considerable influence in London. One word from me, and what few doors remain open to you will close permanently. Your creditors will become less patient. Your family's tolerance will evaporate. Do I make myself clear? The threat hung in the air, unmistakable and absolute. Oliver looked between them, calculation warring with fury in his expression. Finally, he stepped back, adjusting his coat with jerky movements. This is not finished, he said, directing his words at Amelia. You will regret refusing this opportunity when scandal continues to follow you and no other options present themselves. The only thing I regret, Amelia replied quietly, is ever believing you were worth my affection. Now leave my property and do not return. Oliver departed with a final glare that promised future trouble. The moment the door closed behind him, Amelia felt her legs weaken. She sank into the nearest chair, hands trembling with delayed reaction. Julian crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. His face creased with concern. Are you well? He asked gently. Did he harm you? No. He only confirmed what I already knew. She looked at him. This man who had appeared like some avenging force at exactly the right moment. How did you know to come? Thomas saw an unfamiliar horse at your gate. He recognized it as the type desperate men rent when they cannot afford to maintain their own. I came immediately. His hand covered hers carefully. I should have dealt with him more permanently in London when I had the chance. What you did was perfect, Amelia said. You let me speak first. You let me reject him myself, rather than simply removing him. That mattered more than you know. Julian studied her face with such intensity that she felt exposed. You were magnificent, stronger than steel and twice as unyielding. He came here expecting to find you broken and willing to accept crumbs. Instead, he found a woman who knows her own worth. The sincerity in his voice undid something inside her. She had been maintaining such careful control, keeping such careful distance between acknowledgement and action. But Oliver's appearance had clarified everything. Julian had rushed to defend her not because she was weak, but because he valued her. He had threatened a man of his own class to protect her dignity. He had stood back and let her fight her own battle while remaining ready to intervene if needed. That was love, not Oliver's calculated courtship or pretty lies. This quiet, steadfast presence that asked for nothing but offered everything. Julian, she said softly, I am grateful you are here. I will always be here, he replied, for as long as you permit it. Oliver's departure did not bring the peace Amelia had anticipated. 3 days later, a carriage bearing the Fairmont crest appeared in the drive, and her parents descended upon Willowmere with the force of a military invasion. Amelia watched from the parlour window as her mother directed servants to unload trunks, her father's face grim as he surveyed the modest cottage. She met them in the entrance hall, her posture straight and her expression carefully neutral. Lady Margaret embraced her with brittle formality, while Viscount Fairmont remained stiffly near the door, his jaw clenched with barely suppressed anger. We received word from Mr. Wentworth, her mother said without preamble, that you refused his generous offer of reconciliation. Amelia, we must speak immediately about your situation. There are matters you do not understand. There is nothing to discuss, Amelia replied calmly. Oliver came here seeking rescue from his own failures. I declined to provide it. That is the extent of the matter. Her father made a sound of frustration. You declined the opportunity to salvage your reputation and secure your future. Do you have any comprehension of how dire our circumstances have become? Perhaps you should explain these circumstances, Amelia said, gesturing to the parlour, since you have travelled all this way to discuss them. See, inside the modest room, her parents settled with obvious discomfort on furniture they clearly considered beneath their station. Lady Margaret smoothed her travelling dress with agitated movements, while the Viscount paced before the fireplace. Your father has experienced financial reversals, her mother began carefully. Investments that were expected to yield returns have instead produced significant losses. We find ourselves in a delicate position. Delicate? Her father's voice rose sharply. We are nearly bankrupt, Margaret. Amelia deserves the truth. My gambling debts have accumulated beyond what I can repay. Creditors are threatening legal action. We face potential debtor's prison unless immediate arrangements can be made. The words struck Amelia like physical blows. She had suspected financial difficulty from their letters, but not catastrophe of this magnitude. The dowry you promised Oliver, she said slowly, understanding dawning. It never existed, did it? Her father's silence confirmed her suspicion. Lady Margaret twisted her hands together. We believed the investments would resolve themselves before the marriage, that Mr. Wentworth would not inquire too closely until after the ceremony, by which time familial obligation would prevent him from withdrawing. We never anticipated he would discover the truth beforehand. So Oliver abandoned me, not simply for Catherine Bromley's fortune, Amelia said, her voice hollow, but because he learned I had no dowry at all. And you knew. You let me believe I was marrying for affection when I was actually being sold to settle your debts. We were protecting the family, her mother protested. You have responsibilities to your position, to maintaining our social standing. You were using me, Amelia interrupted, anger finally breaking through her composure. I was a commodity in a transaction that failed. And now you come here demanding I accept Oliver's suit because you need me to solve problems you created through your own choices. Her father stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. We need you to make a practical decision. Oliver is willing to overlook the dowry situation if you agree to marry him. His debts and ours can be managed through strategic consolidation. It is the only solution that salvages anything from this disaster. The only solution for you, Amelia said. Not for me. I will not marry a man who betrayed me publicly to rescue parents who lied to me privately. Lady Margaret's expression hardened. Then what do you propose? That we allow our family name to be dragged through scandal while you hide in the countryside playing at gardening? You have obligations, Amelia. You cannot simply abandon them because your feelings were hurt. My feelings were not hurt, Amelia replied, her voice cold. My trust was destroyed. There is a considerable difference. She stood, moving to the window where she could see the garden she had rebuilt through months of solitary labor. You speak of obligations and family duty. But what obligation did you fulfill when you gambled away our security? What duty did you honor when you attempted to deceive Oliver and, failing that, expected me to accept the consequences of your failures? You ungrateful child, her mother hissed. Everything we did was to secure your future. Everything you did was to maintain appearances while hoping someone else would pay the cost, Amelia interrupted. I am sorry for your circumstances, truly, but I will not compound your mistakes by making the greatest mistake of my life. Her father's face flushed dangerously. You have no income of your own. This cottage belongs to the family estate. How long do you think you can maintain this fantasy of independence before reality forces you back to London? The cottage was my grandmother's separate property, Amelia said. Facts she had verified with the family solicitor weeks ago. It passed to me directly under her will, along with a modest annual income from the trust she established. I am not as dependent on your support as you believed. The silence that followed felt heavy with shocked betrayal. Her mother's face paled, while her father stared as though seeing a stranger. Finally, Lady Margaret rose with rigid dignity. I see we have wasted our journey, she said, her voice brittle. You have chosen selfishness over family loyalty. When you find yourself completely isolated by scandal, with no respectable prospects remaining, do not expect us to welcome you back with sympathy. I expect nothing from you, Amelia replied quietly. That, at least, will spare us all future disappointments. Her parents departed within the hour, their carriage disappearing down the lane in a cloud of dust and unspoken recriminations. Amelia stood watching until they vanished from view, feeling simultaneously liberated and bereft. She had severed the ties that bound her to obligation and expectation, but the cutting had left wounds that would take time to heal. She was still standing at the window when Julian arrived an hour later, his expression concerned. Thomas had obviously informed him of the Fairmonts' arrival and departure. He entered the parlour without knocking, taking in her rigid posture and pale face. "They told you everything," he said. It was not a question. "They told me they are bankrupt, that my dowry never existed, that Oliver discovered the truth and fled to save himself from a marriage that would bring him nothing but debt." Her voice remained steady through sheer force of will. "They want me to marry him anyway, to somehow salvage their reputations and finances through advantageous union with a man equally desperate." Julian crossed to her, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth. "And you refused?" "Of course I refused. But Julian," she turned to face him, and he saw the devastation in her eyes. "They lied to me, used me. They cared nothing for my happiness, only for what I could provide them. I feel like I have been walking through my life blind, seeing only what I wanted to see rather than what actually existed." "You saw what loving parents should be," he said gently. "You are not at fault for having reasonable expectations of the people who should have protected you." "I am a fool." "You are human." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were falling. "Amelia, listen to me. Your parents' failures are not yours to carry. Their choices do not diminish your worth. You are intelligent, strong, capable of extraordinary resilience. You rebuilt these gardens from wilderness. You can rebuild your life with equal success." "Can I?" The question emerged as a whisper. "Everyone I trusted has betrayed me. Oliver, my parents. How do I know who to believe anymore?" "You asked me once why I came to Derbyshire," Julian said, his blue eyes intense in the afternoon light. "You asked why I remained. I told you it was because I saw your courage at St. Mary's. That was true, but incomplete. I remained because in a world of performance and calculation, you were genuine, because your kindness to servants was not strategic, but instinctive, because when cruelty shattered your world, you did not become cruel in return. You simply became more careful, which is wisdom, not weakness." His words wrapped around her like shelter. "You have been so patient with me, never demanding more than I could give. Because patience is easy when the outcome matters. Amelia, I have watched you heal yourself over these months, watched you find strength you did not know you possessed. I would wait years more if needed, simply to remain in your presence. But I want you to know." He paused, choosing words with visible care. "What I feel for you is not pity or obligation. It is profound admiration for who you are, deep affection for the person you have become, and hope that someday you might trust me enough to allow me closer to your heart." She looked at him, this man who had defended her against Oliver, who had helped her rebuild gardens without taking credit, who had offered friendship when romance felt impossible and never pressured for more. The realization came like dawn breaking, gradual then suddenly complete. "I already trust you," she said. "That terrifies me. But it is true. Then will you trust me now?" He stepped closer, closing the final distance between them. "Trust that I mean what I say, that I will not abandon or betray you, that what I offer is not convenience, but genuine regard, built on months of knowing exactly who you are." The storm outside had been building all afternoon, and as Julian finished speaking, rain began to fall. Amelia heard it against the windows, steady and cleansing. She thought of her parents' departure, Oliver's rejection, all the ways her old life had dissolved. And she thought of Julian, who had appeared in the wreckage and stayed. "I trust you," she whispered, and reached for him. His arms came around her carefully, as though she were something precious and fragile. But Amelia did not feel fragile. She felt grounded and certain in ways she had never experienced with Oliver's charming lies or her parents' conditional love. This was real. This steady heartbeat beneath her cheek, these strong arms holding her through grief, this quiet certainty that she was valued for herself alone. "Stay," she said against his chest. "Please stay. Always," he promised, and meant it. The weeks that followed were a careful dance between healing and hope. Julian did not press for formal courtship, despite what had passed between them during the storm. Instead, he became a constant presence at Willowmere, their friendship deepening into something more profound, yet still undefined. They rode together across the Derbyshire hills, worked side by side in the gardens, shared meals where conversation ranged from philosophical debates to comfortable silence. Mrs. Hartley watched their progression with knowing approval, while Thomas Yates maintained respectful discretion about his employer's frequent absences from Thornwick Lodge. It was Mrs. Hartley who suggested, one afternoon over tea, that perhaps it was time for Amelia to consider returning to society. Not London immediately, but gradual reintroduction through local connections that might smooth her eventual re-entry to wider circles. "Your Grace has been exceedingly patient," Mrs. Hartley observed, directing her comment to Julian with gentle frankness. "But sooner or later, Miss Fairmont's situation must be formally resolved. The countryside provides excellent refuge, but it cannot remain permanent exile unless that is genuinely what she wishes." Amelia set down her teacup carefully. "What I wish is irrelevant if society has decided I am ruined beyond redemption." "Society decides nothing permanently," Julian replied. "Power and influence shape perception. If I formally announce my intention to court you, present you as my intended duchess, society will realign its judgments accordingly. No one questions a duke's choice of bride without considerable risk to themselves." The casual mention of duchess made Amelia's breath catch. They had avoided discussing marriage explicitly, though it hung unspoken between every shared glance and lingering touch. "You would face criticism," she said quietly. "Whispers about why you chose someone touched by scandal." "Let them whisper," Julian said with the dismissive arrogance that sometimes surfaced when his ducal authority was challenged. "I have wealth, title, and influence they cannot match. More importantly, I choose you not despite your circumstances, but because of who you are. Anyone who cannot understand that distinction is unworthy of consideration." Mrs. Hartley smiled into her tea. "Well spoken, Your Grace. Miss Fairmont, you must decide what future you want: permanent countryside retirement or eventual return to broader society. Both are valid choices, but they require different strategies." That evening, Amelia walked alone through the gardens now fully restored, considering Mrs. Hartley's words. The roses her grandmother had planted decades ago bloomed magnificently, proof that careful tending could resurrect what seemed lost. She had rebuilt these gardens. Perhaps she could rebuild her life as well, not as the frightened girl who fled London, but as the woman she had become through solitude and Julian's steady companionship. For months, she had defined courage as the act of leaving, walking away from the altar, from London, from the expectations that had nearly broken her. Now, as she traced familiar paths between beds she had coaxed back to life, she began to suspect there was another kind of bravery: to walk back into the very rooms that had once witnessed her humiliation, not as a supplicant seeking pardon, but as a woman who knew her own worth. The decision, once made, felt surprisingly simple. She would return to society, but on her own terms, with Julian beside her as partner rather than rescuer. She would face the whispers with the same dignity she had shown at the altar, proving that scandal could wound, but not destroy. When she informed Julian of her decision the following morning, his expression transformed with relief and something deeper, pride mixed with profound affection. "We should do this properly," he said. "Return to London together. Announce our engagement formally. Give society no room to doubt my intentions or your value. There will be complications," Amelia warned. "Oliver may attempt further interference. My parents will likely cause difficulties. Your family. Do you even have family who might object? An uncle who serves as trustee to the estate. Several distant cousins I rarely see. None whose opinions matter more than yours." Julian took her hands, his touch warm and steady. "Amelia, I am not asking you to face London for my sake or society's. I am asking whether you are ready to stop hiding from a world that wronged you and claim the life you deserve." She thought of her grandmother, who had lived here after widowhood by choice, not exile, who had built beauty from wilderness through sheer determination. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." The journey to London took 3 days. during which they stopped at respectable inns, where Julian ensured Amelia had separate accommodation and proper chaperonage through a maid he hired specifically for propriety's sake. Every detail was managed to prevent additional scandal, though Amelia suspected rumours would spread regardless. A duke travelling with an unmarried woman, even with every courtesy observed, would generate speculation. They arrived in London on a grey October afternoon, the city vastly different from the spring morning when Amelia had fled. Julian escorted her directly to his townhouse in Mayfair, where his staff received her with such careful deference that she knew he had prepared them thoroughly. A suite of rooms had been arranged for her use, and an elderly cousin of Julian's was already in residence to serve as chaperone, ensuring absolute propriety. The formal announcement of their engagement appeared in the papers 2 days later. Julian had composed it with characteristic directness. Julian Merrick, Duke of Hawthorne, is pleased to announce his betrothal to Miss Amelia Fairmont, daughter of Viscount and Lady Fairmont. The engagement was formed during residence in Derbyshire and is the result of sincere attachment and mutual regard. A wedding date will be announced in due course. The response was immediate and divided. Some of Julian's social circle expressed delight, others bewilderment that the Duke of Ice had finally chosen to marry, and still others whispered about the irregularity of courting a woman so recently involved in public scandal. Amelia heard none of it directly. Julian shielded her carefully during those first days, but she knew the whispers existed. The first true test came at a ball hosted by the Duchess of Pemberton, a woman whose social standing made her approval nearly mandatory for acceptance in highest circles. Julian had secured an invitation and escorted Amelia with such visible pride that entering the ballroom felt less terrifying than she had anticipated. Conversations faltered as they appeared. Amelia felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, judging her, comparing her to the humiliated bride of months ago. But Julian's hand at her back remained steady, his expression daring anyone to show disrespect. The Duchess herself approached, a formidable woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper wit. "Your Grace," she said to Julian, "how unexpected to see you at a ball. You typically avoid such gatherings with admirable consistency." "I had no reason to attend before," Julian replied smoothly. "Now I have every reason. May I present my betrothed, Miss Amelia Fairmont?" The Duchess studied Amelia with disconcerting intensity. "Miss Fairmont, I understand you have been residing in Derbyshire. Quite the change from London society." "Yes, Your Grace," Amelia replied, keeping her voice steady. "I found the countryside beneficial for reflection and restoration. Sensible. London can be exhausting, particularly when one becomes the subject of unkind gossip." The Duchess's expression softened slightly. "My late husband once told me that true character shows not in avoiding scandal, but in how one recovers from it. You appear to have recovered admirably, and His Grace's regard speaks volumes about your worth. He is not a man easily impressed." The words, delivered with such authority, rippled through the nearby guests. Amelia felt the atmosphere shift, whispers changing tone from judgment to speculation. The Duchess of Pemberton's approval carried immense weight. If she accepted Amelia, others would follow or risk social disadvantage. The evening progressed with cautious success. Some guests remained coolly formal, but others approached with genuine warmth once the Duchess's blessing became clear. Julian remained at Amelia's side throughout, a solid presence that announced she was under his protection, and any insult to her would be considered an insult to him. Then, across the crowded ballroom, Amelia saw Oliver Wentworth. He stood near the refreshment tables, dressed in evening clothes that looked slightly shabby compared to the surrounding elegance. His face was thinner than she remembered, his expression carrying desperation he could no longer fully conceal. When their eyes met, something ugly flickered across his features. Julian noticed immediately, his body tensing beside her. "Do you wish to leave?" he asked quietly. "No," Amelia replied, though her heart raced. Running accomplished nothing before. It will accomplish nothing now. In Derbyshire, she had refused him for the sake of her own sanity, reclaiming her right to live without the weight of his betrayal. Here, beneath chandeliers and the watchful gaze of London society, the stakes were different. This was not merely about private closure. This was about who she would be remembered as. The girl who had been abandoned, or the woman who had chosen herself. Oliver began moving toward them through the crowd. Julian stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between them with subtle protectiveness. When Oliver reached them, he offered a bow that was correct, but held mockery in its precision. "Your Grace," he said to Julian. "Miss Fairmont, how delightful to see you both." "Mr. Wentworth," Julian replied, his voice cold enough to freeze. "I had not expected to find you at such a gathering. I thought your financial circumstances precluded participation in events requiring appropriate attire." Oliver's smile tightened. "I manage. Though some of us do not have the advantage of ducal resources to smooth our paths through difficulty. Some of us do not create our difficulties through cowardice and dishonesty," Julian countered. "You would do well to remember that your current circumstances are consequences of your own choices." The nearby guests had fallen silent, sensing confrontation. Oliver's face flushed, but he turned his attention to Amelia with poisonous sweetness. "Miss Fairmont, I hope you understand what you are undertaking. His Grace is known for his coldness, his inability to form genuine attachments. When the novelty of rescue wears thin, you may find yourself bound to a man incapable of true affection." Before Julian could respond, Amelia stepped forward. "Mr. Wentworth," she said clearly, her voice carrying to the listening audience, "you know nothing of genuine affection. You have confused calculation for courtship and self-interest for devotion. His Grace has shown me more authentic regard in months than you managed in false months of pretense. I suggest you leave this gathering before you embarrass yourself further." Oliver's expression twisted with fury. "You think you have won, but society has a long memory. They will never forget that you were left at the altar, that you fled like a coward, and they will remember that I confronted a man of your character with more grace than you deserve." Amelia interrupted. "Now leave. You are not welcome in my presence." For a moment, Oliver looked as though he might continue his attack. Then Julian moved forward slightly, his posture radiating threat despite making no overt gesture. Oliver stepped back, his courage failing, and retreated through the crowd with what dignity he could salvage. The ballroom remained silent for several heartbeats. Then the Duchess of Pemberton began to clap, slow and deliberate applause that drew all attention to her. "Well said, Miss Fairmont," she announced. "It is refreshing to see someone handle a scoundrel with such admirable directness." Other guests began applauding as well, and Amelia felt the final barrier break. She had faced Oliver publicly and prevailed. Society had witnessed her strength rather than her victimhood. Whatever whispers continued, they would carry less power now. Julian took her hand, his expression showing pride and affection mixed with relief. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "Steel wrapped in silk." "I learned from observing you," Amelia replied, and meant it. His steadiness had taught her that true strength required neither aggression nor submission, simply unwavering certainty in one's own worth. That night, as Julian escorted her back to his townhouse, Amelia looked at the city she had fled months ago and felt no fear. She had returned not as the same frightened girl, but as someone fundamentally changed. Whatever challenges remained, she would face them with Julian beside her, not as her rescuer, but as her equal partner in building a life neither shame nor scandal could diminish. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning in Millbrook, not in the grand London churches where ducal marriages typically occurred, but in the small stone chapel where Mrs. Hartley's late husband had once preached. It was Amelia's choice, and Julian had agreed without hesitation, understanding what it meant to marry where she had found strength rather than where scandal had broken her. The chapel filled with an unusual assembly. Mrs. Hartley sat in the front pew, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Thomas Yates stood beside Julian, his weathered face showing pride in his employer's happiness. Mr. and Mrs. Davies occupied a place of honour, having travelled from Willowmere with flowers cut from the restored gardens. A handful of Julian's London acquaintances had made the journey, along with the Duchess of Pemberton, whose attendance signalled unequivocal social approval. Notably absent were Amelia's parents, who had sent neither acknowledgement nor blessing after receiving the wedding invitation. Their absence stung less than Amelia had anticipated. She had built a new family from people who valued her for herself. Mrs. Hartley with her motherly wisdom, the Davies with their quiet loyalty, Thomas with his respectful service, and Julian with his unwavering devotion. Blood did not define family. Choice and constancy did. Amelia wore a gown of ivory silk, simpler than the elaborate dress that had hung unworn in London months ago, but infinitely more meaningful. Mrs. Hartley had helped her select it, and the older woman's practical eye had ensured elegance without ostentation. Her only jewellery was her grandmother's pearl necklace, a connection to the woman whose legacy had provided refuge and independence. Julian stood at the altar in dark mourning dress, his expression when she entered carrying a bouquet of Willowmere roses, more eloquent than any poet could achieve. His eyes held wonder, as though he could not quite believe this moment had arrived, that the woman who had rebuilt gardens from wilderness had chosen to build a life with him. The ceremony was brief and traditional, the rector's words about commitment and partnership resonating in the small space. When Julian took her hand to slip the gold band onto her finger, his touch was steady and sure. "I promise you honesty," he said quietly, adding his own words to the formal vows. "I promise you respect and partnership. I promise that you will never doubt your worth or my constancy." "I promise you trust," Amelia replied, her voice clear despite the emotion tightening her throat. "I promise to choose courage over fear. I promise that we will build something real, not performative, together." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, but carried depth, a promise of intimacy yet to be fully explored, of partnership already firmly established. When they turned to face their small gathering, the applause felt genuine in ways London society events never had. The wedding breakfast took place at Willowmere Cottage, which Mrs. Hartley had helped transform into a space worthy of celebration. Simple foods beautifully prepared, local wines, conversation that flowed naturally rather than following rigid social protocols. The Duchess of Pemberton surprised everyone by removing her gloves and helping to serve cake, declaring that authenticity was vastly underrated in modern society. As afternoon deepened toward evening and guests began departing, Julian and Amelia walked together through the gardens that had brought them together. The late autumn air carried a chill, but the roses still bloomed, hardy varieties that survived frost. Julian's arms circled her waist, a comfortable intimacy that would have been scandalous months ago, but now felt perfectly natural. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "About the small ceremony, about marrying in the countryside rather than making a grand London spectacle?" "None," Amelia replied with certainty. "This was perfect because it was real. Every person present chose to be here, to witness our commitment. That matters more than filling a cathedral with people attending out of obligation or curiosity." They reached the greenhouse where they had sheltered from the summer storm, where Julian had first spoken plainly about his feelings. The glass panels reflected the setting sun, turning ordinary structure into something golden and transformative. Amelia remembered standing here months ago, frightened and uncertain, unable to imagine trusting anyone again. "Do you remember," Julian said, as though reading her thoughts, "when I told you I could not offer poetry or grand gestures?" "I remember. You offered honesty instead, which proved infinitely more valuable." He turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face with careful tenderness. "I want to amend that statement. I may not write sonnets, but I can promise you this. Every day of our marriage, I will choose you, not from duty or social expectation, but because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known. You transformed ruin into beauty, both in these gardens and in your own life. You faced cruelty with dignity and betrayal with strength. You taught me that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to risk trust despite past wounds." Tears blurred Amelia's vision. "You gave me time to heal without demanding I hurry the process. You showed me that genuine regard does not require performance or perfection. Julian, I was so broken when you found me. I thought Oliver had destroyed my ability to believe in anything good. He broke your illusions." Julian corrected gently, "But illusions are meant to be broken. What he could not touch was your essential self, your intelligence, your resilience, your capacity for growth and renewal. Those were always yours, Amelia. I simply reminded you they existed. She reached up to trace the small scar near his temple, a detail she had noticed during their first summer together. We have both carried grief. Your brother, my betrayal. Perhaps that is what allowed us to understand each other. Perhaps, he agreed. Or perhaps some connections transcend explanation. I saw you standing in that church, abandoned and humiliated, and something in my chest shifted. I did not know then what it meant, but I knew I could not simply walk away and forget you existed. Night was falling properly now, the garden surrendering to darkness, broken only by lamplight from the cottage windows. Inside, Mrs. Hartley and Thomas would be supervising final cleanup, ensuring everything was properly managed so the newly married couple could have privacy. Tomorrow they would travel to one of Julian's estates for a brief wedding journey, before returning to divide their time between London obligations and Derbyshire refuge. But tonight belonged to beginnings, to the tentative exploration of marriage not built on illusion or social advantage, but on genuine partnership, forged through months of careful trust building. Come inside, Amelia said softly. We have a lifetime of gardens ahead of us, but tonight I simply want to be with you, without audience or expectation. Julian smiled, that rare, unguarded expression that transformed his usually severe features into something warm and open. That sounds perfect. No performance, no pretense, just us. They walked back to the cottage hand in hand, leaving the gardens to their autumn dormancy. Behind them, the roses that had witnessed their courtship would sleep through winter, gathering strength for spring's renewal. Like those roses, Amelia and Julian had weathered storms and emerged stronger, their roots deep enough now to sustain them through whatever seasons lay ahead. Inside Willowmere's warm embrace, Amelia realized this was what her grandmother had known, that true happiness was not found in grand London ballrooms or elaborate social performances, but in moments of genuine connection, in gardens tended with patience, in partnerships built on honesty, in the quiet courage required to choose love again after betrayal had taught fear. She had fled to this place, broken and seeking refuge. She left it whole, not because someone had rescued her, but because she had learned to rescue herself. And in doing so, she had found someone willing to walk beside her as an equal, building beauty from ruins together. The cottage door closed behind them, and whatever lay beyond, society's continued whispers, her parents' eventual reckoning, the ordinary challenges of married life, could wait. Tonight was simply theirs, the first of thousands of nights to come, each one a choice to continue building the life they had imagined during those long summer afternoons in grandmother's garden. Some love stories begin with grand passion. Theirs had begun with quiet persistence, with garden soil under fingernails, and honest conversations that acknowledged pain without being consumed by it. It was not the story Amelia had imagined when she stood at St. Mary's altar awaiting a groom who never arrived. It was infinitely better.